All right, happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Was very excited to read something yesterday. A dear rabbi of mine, a teacher of mine, a mentor of mine, a friend of mine, Rabbi Siegel from Farakaway, a very brilliant individual. He writes very beautiful things on the internet. Was writing about Thanksgiving, and he brought there Abraham Lincoln's 1863 Thanksgiving Proclamation. Now, the history of the Thanksgiving Proclamations is quite an interesting one. Historically speaking, it really goes back originally to George Washington, as well as to even further to the governors of the individual states, even before the constitutional system Washington would occasionally make a Thanksgiving proclamation. This was not something that was done every year necessarily by all the presidents. This was not a national holiday that was an annual event in the original times of the founding of our country. It didn't really become an annual event. Really, it started around Lincoln's time, and then in the early 20th century, it really became a national holiday in the legal sense. We generally associate Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock, but there's really even much more to it. And there's a general theme that went through the original Thanksgivings that we had as a country. One interesting thing that I wanted to bring up before we really get into the meat and potatoes of what I want to address today is something that's incidental but also fundamental as well. Washington would make Thanksgiving proclamations, as did Adams. But interestingly, during the whole 8 years of the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, there was not one time that he issued a Thanksgiving proclamation. Now, if you look at the language that Washington, Adams, and so forth used in their Thanksgiving proclamations, there was a tremendous amount of religious imagery, religious language in these proclamations. Lincoln also, who I want to focus on, had tremendous and inspiring and insightful and brilliant religious insights that really bear out to be studied the way we would study Lahavdil, any of our own religious texts. And really that's, I don't have it in front of me and I'm not going to go through it right now, but if I have time, maybe when I have a quiet time, to actually sit down and read through it with you all and study this text and really compare it to its biblical roots and apply it to today, it's really quite brilliant and incredible, and timely and timeless. Both timely for the time when it was written, and timeless really for all times. Now, Jefferson, though, just quickly to go through this idea with Jefferson did not issue Thanksgiving proclamations as president, and that would seem to go along with what we all know. Jefferson is very famously, in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Church, he spoke of a wall of separation between church and state. And what he meant by that was that the churches were afraid that the state was going to discriminate against them, particularly because Jefferson was not a particularly religious man. Many people would say he was what we would call today spiritual but not religious, to use a modern parlance. He wasn't a fan of organized religion in his own personal spiritual walk. And yet, folks who did have organized religions were afraid that this meant that they would lose their freedoms, their rights. And so Jefferson ensured them that there was a wall of separation between church and state, not in the sense that we understand it today and it's been understood in America since the late 40s or so, is when really this became enshrined by the courts in a way that really Jefferson warned us about, really, that there would be this tyrannical oligarchy of the judiciary that we have seen. And hopefully now that, thank God, we didn't have Hillary Clinton, who would put more of these tyrannical oligarchs on the bench as her predecessor did. Hopefully Donald Trump, even though he's not maybe the most trustworthy person politically, he's an unknown really politically, but his promise to appoint originalists to the Constitution who will uphold to the bench, who will uphold the Constitution as it was originally intended and not how it was tyrannically interpreted, thanks to the progressives, really, since FDR really packed the courts. It was known that he wanted to add more seats to the courts, to pack the courts. That he didn't get away with, thankfully, but unfortunately he was there for so long because of the sad and unfortunate issues that this country was going through at the time. So therefore, we found ourselves with the court that was packed with progressives, people who had no regard for the original intent of our founding documents, but rather sought to put their own spin onto it. And I don't care if it's to the right or to the left. That's not the job of the courts. The job of the courts is to uphold the Constitution. And it's not about pushing this policy, pushing that policy, because really conservative or right-wing progressivism is just as bad and sometimes even worse than left-wing progressivism. And that's something we have to fear, because Trump does have a progressive history. And is he going to ignore the Constitution the way that Obama did? It's very dangerous either way, whether it's the right or the left. I mean, one of the worst things we've had in our history in America that just, was just foolish and nonsensical was Prohibition. And it just was a complete and utter failure, and it was progressivism. Now, it was perhaps a conservative form of progressivism, but it was really in line with progressivist ideals, which are not progressive at all. That's just what they name their movement. They're really regressive. It's really going back to, the tyrannical monarchies that this country was set up to rebel against. And instead of monarchy, we have oligarchy, particularly, like we said, of the judiciary. However, Jefferson himself, although he did not make any Thanksgiving proclamations as president, when he was governor of Virginia, he did make Thanksgiving proclamations. And so that echoes a theme of federalism, that states, when he said that there was a wall of separation between church and state, he meant on the federal level by the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, to say that the federal government would not have one particular denomination of Christianity as its official religion. But there was certainly, on the state level, permission to have an official have an official state religion, and on the local level as well. And many of the states maintained their original state religions for many, many years after they ratified the Constitution and the First Amendment. Because it was never an intent of the First Amendment to remove that right, which was protected by the 10th Amendment, from the states or the local governments. And so the foolishness, for example, of those who would say that villages and towns cannot have religions is under the First Amendment is totally ignorant, because the First Amendment applies only to the federal government and not to state and local governments in the sense of the Establishment Clause. Because just look at the wording. Congress shall not establish. It doesn't say state legislatures shall not establish, or local legislatures shall not establish, or school boards shall not establish. There's no such thing. This is only specifically talking about Congress, meaning the federal government. And so that's why Jefferson had no qualms as a state executive to make a Thanksgiving proclamation, but as a federal executive, he felt it was out of his duties. Now, to go back to what we were originally speaking of, it's really worthwhile to read Lincoln's 1863 Thanksgiving Proclamation, because on so many levels, it's just a brilliant, brilliant work. This was Lincoln's brilliance, was that he was able to say so much with so few words. Now, it was longer than some more recent Thanksgiving proclamations, but still, the brevity and the gravitas of Lincoln's words are incredible, outstanding. It's just beyond belief, and it's just worthwhile to look at. Now, he starts off by discussing what we have to be thankful for, and the way he discusses it is as follows. First of all, who do we have to be thankful to? Is to God. It's not just a general count your blessings, be thankful, just to feel good. It's remembering who gave us all the blessings that we have is Almighty God. That's for the first thing. Second thing is that Lincoln says that many people, because we are living in such a blessed nation where things are so good all the time, it's easy to forget who's responsible for that, because it's just always good. I'm reminded of, it's hard to believe it's already 25 years ago that the show started, more than that, a show we used to watch all those many years ago, Seinfeld, there was one time when the character George was sitting and talking to his therapist, and he said, God would not let me be successful. I knew this. And then the therapist said, but George, I thought you said you don't believe in God. And he said, well, I do for the bad things. And really, that's the way things are. Yeah, people, when things are bad, they remember God, but when things are good, they tend to forget. And when things are good, that's when we have to remember God. Because, as we're going to discuss in a moment, but anyway, so Lincoln is saying that he's really paraphrasing an idea that we have in the book of Deuteronomy, Yishman, Yeshurun, V'yivat, that Jeshurun, which is a poetic term for Israel, it comes from the term Yerusha, perhaps, even though it's Yeshurun and not Yerushun, but but quite often in Hebrew, letters are often reversed poetically, and I think perhaps that could be one of the terms of it, but also Yashar, Yeshurun, the one who was, so Yerusha, we received an inheritance from God, but also Yashar, which is the straight way of reading it, means straight, upright. Yeshurun, the straight up one, the one who was honest, the one who was straightforward, became fat and kicked. What does that mean? That now they have everything they need. They forgot who gave them all these things that we need. That's why after we eat, the Bible commands us to thank God. Most people are familiar with saying grace before you eat, and that's just common sense, because we're hungry and we need God, and so we thank God for the bounty that we're about to enjoy. But after we eat, we often forget about God. But if we remember to thank God after we eat, when we're already full, that's so much deeper. That's so much more important, because that's the time when it's so easy to forget. But Lincoln points out that although most people who don't think about God all the time will forget about God when things are good, but when things are really, really good, it's very hard to forget about God. And he said, right now, 1863, things are really, really, really good. Now wait a second, 1863, we're in the middle of a civil war. The bloodiest, most horrible conflict that America has ever been in is a conflict, where obviously the most Americans were killed for the simple fact that it was only mostly Americans fighting, all right, but still, even without that, the sheer number of casualties was horrible, and the pains and the diseases and all kinds of things that went on in the battlefield, horrible, horrible things. Yet, Lincoln says, the good that God has given us is very, very good. What is the good that he's talking about? Well, he says, think about it this way. We can think about it in future history after Lincoln, 90, 100 years after Lincoln, civil wars. What happens when a country has a civil war? Some little country most people never think about, somewhere in Asia, has a civil war, and it becomes a worldwide conflict. We saw this in the 50s with Korea. We saw this starting in the 50s, leading into the 60s, and into the 70s with Vietnam. That civil wars often become international affairs. Whether it is that those who are enemies of that state will take advantage of it. You would imagine, America might still have some enemies in 1863, and they're going to be like, oh, let's take advantage of this war, which happened on a small scale, but nothing really major. Or they would actually join forces because these other countries have some interest in this fight, and it would lead to an international conflagration of war. And yet, for the most part, that didn't happen. That's on the international scene. What about on the home front? Lincoln points out that usually when there's a civil war in most countries, the whole country is affected. Everybody suffers. The war will go into the streets. And yet, Lincoln says, no, we see it. The pain and the suffering has been confined to the theater of the battlefield. And beyond that, people's lives are continuing as normal. And what do we mean continuing as normal? Generally, when you have a wartime economy, there is self-sacrifice on the civilian front. People have to, the people suffer a little bit. The people have to, they don't have everything they need. They have to have some self-sacrifice. There's rationing. It's all part of the war effort. And patriotism helps people, endure that and live through that because they have a goal that they're looking forward to, But still, you have to have your victory garden. You have to, Yet, during the Civil War, there was such abundance that the crops were abundant, the mines were abundant, the steel, the precious metals, the coal, all of these things that they needed for the war effort and to keep commerce going on the civilian front, they were all fine. They were all extra. And so he said we have to see the providence of God in this. I mean, we should really think about that in our own lives, that we had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that most civilians didn't even have on their minds because God blessed this country so much. Now, and so Lincoln says, I therefore invite my fellow citizens. He's not making a proclamation as a monarch, as a, he's saying, I'm inviting. You don't have to, it's an invitation. My fellow citizens, I'm not your king. I'm a citizen just like you. To set aside this time of thanksgiving, a time of thanksgiving for penitence, meaning to start it off with asking God forgiveness for our sins. And of course, the biggest sin he was talking about was slavery. And he was speaking about how the war was an inevitable punishment for the sins of... He didn't mention slavery by name, but it's clear that that's what he's talking about. And that we have to do penance. We have to have penitence, humility before God. It's not just thanksgiving, but it's humility. This, Lincoln not only said we should just have a feeling, but actual, and then that should then be added. Once we have the penitence first, then we have thanksgiving and praise. But he said, practically, how do we do it? By taking care of the widows, the war widows, the poor, the orphans, the injured soldiers. That's why. That's how we can do this practically. It's just so incredible. It's just so wonderful. And to read something like this, it's really a blessing. Now, and then he ends off saying the date that he wants it to be on and so forth. We have to take these messages into our own lives. Thanksgiving is not just a time to watch a football game or a parade or some, if you're me, maybe some monster movies. It's not just a time to hang out with your family and eat turkey and all these things. It's a time of, and it's not only a time of thanksgiving, but it's a time of penitence. These are the Jewish ideals of tshuva me'ahava, of returning to God through love. Because that when we're dancing on Simchas Torah, we still have Yom Kippur in our hearts. That when we when we are expressing joy and feasting, we are doing an act of penance in our feasting. Meaning, I'm not saying don't watch the football game. I'm not saying don't enjoy the Thanksgiving feast. I'm saying that it should be with a spirit of reverence, of humility, of awe, that it should be a spiritual experience, that you're standing before Almighty God while we're engaging in this act of thanksgiving. We should restore Thanksgiving Day to its spiritual roots. And so while you're enjoying these things, you're thanking God. While you're enjoying the food, the family, the television shows, whatever it is, you should be thanking God. Not just before, and the way to do it, because maybe we don't have a mind that we can be in a meditative state all throughout this. Most of us aren't. I certainly am not. So how do we do it? By before and after, making parentheses around it. We start off with thanksgiving, with the grace before we eat, and we end off with thanksgiving. Noid L'cha. We give thanks to you. And in our tradition, the Jewish tradition, we say blessings before we eat. We say blessings after we eat. So too, no matter what your tradition is, not only to make the time before, which is very important, but to make the time after, which is perhaps even more important. And by that, we make our whole time a time of spirituality, a time of meaningfulness, and a time of joy, because by doing that, it injects a spirit of joy into our hearts, into our experiences, into every bit of food we put in our mouth. It has an extra sweet flavor because of the spiritual joy in it. And in that way, we could be blessed with all the things we need. What do I mean by that? Because thanksgiving is the key. Gratitude is the key to everything we need. Because precisely when we're in a dark time, precisely when we're in a civil war, when we're in some other difficult time, is precisely the time. And it's not only that, but even the commercialism can be an expression of thanksgiving to God. Because we're engaging in something we enjoy and we thank God for our bounty. We render this a gift to God. And so by virtue of this, when we give thanks, even in a dark and difficult time, we're granted the things we need. We can escape from the difficulty. Ki b'simcha tzeitzeu. Isaiah says you will go out with joy, and the Hasidic masters say that means that through joy, which Reb Nachman Breslover and many others note is connected indelibly to thanksgiving, to gratitude. The way to joy is gratitude. The path to joy is gratitude. Through joy, we can go out of any difficulty. If we're in a difficult situation, let's thank God for the good things that we do have. And then God will see, this is someone who is worthy of enjoying. And so I will give him more things to be thankful for. And even if, let's say, our situation doesn't change physically, but emotionally and spiritually, it will get better because we'll feel happy because of our spirit of thanksgiving. And so I could offer just to be thankful for things that are so big, but we take them for granted because they're so big. One thing that I could give you an example for. Astronomy tells us that Earth, compared to the sun, is in the Goldilocks zone. What does that mean? It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right. Just right for what? For liquid water to exist. You go to Mars, all the water is ice. You go to Venus, Mercury, if there's any water there at all, it's vapor. Here, water exists in all three: ice, liquid, and vapor. mostly liquid. And that's how life exists on this planet. Life would not be able to exist as we know it without that. And so that's a gift from God. Also, the molecular structure of water, we're going to see in a few weeks where I live, the top of the lake freezes, but the fish underneath are still alive. When anything else that's frozen is heavier than the liquid. Solids usually heavier than liquids should sink to the bottom. If that happened, all the stuff on the bottom would die. And life really wouldn't be able to exist on Earth that way. But instead it floats to the top. How is that? It's because of the molecular structure of water, we know. But it's also a miracle, a gift from God. And so, you might have some water to drink or something, and you make a bracha. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, the King of the universe, for all was made by his word. We have that water. It's a miracle. It's something we take for granted. And really, it's not just water. All the food we eat has water in it. Everything has water in it. Our bodies are mostly water. Our planet is mostly water, the surface of our planet. And so to think how much we have to be thankful for, just for water, it's an incredible thing. And like I said, if we inject that attitude of gratitude into our lives are going to get much better. And I certainly am feeling feelings of thanksgiving to God for the political changes that took place in this country. That mostly thankful that Hillary Clinton lost. I don't know about Donald Trump, but I did vote for him because I wanted to give him a chance. Hillary we knew would be horrible. Trump, maybe yes, maybe no. We don't know. At first I was disappointed that he really wasn't enough of a right-wing constitutionalist in the way that I understand it, and that I want someone like Ted Cruz who would restore the country to its founding. But on the other hand, I was sitting at work, and someone asked me the day after Election Day, well, who'd you vote for? And are you happy about the election results? And I was kind of reluctant. I didn't know, because I was in the room, I was the only person who was not an immigrant. And there was other chaplains. One a man of color, one a Muslim, all three of them immigrants. And yet they all told me they voted for Trump. Even the imam voted for Trump. We see now that Trump got 3 times as much of the Muslim vote than Romney did. And I think it's not because of his rhetoric, this and that. It's really, although we could say maybe a lot of people they want to keep out. There's a reason they came to America. They wanted to get away from certain elements. I can understand that. But there's really something more in the essence of who Trump could be. Is that because he has 1 foot in the left and 1 foot in the right and 1 foot in the center and he's all over the place, he could really be a great uniter to this country. He could unite this country in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. A lot of people don't want that to happen, and so they're paying people who didn't even vote to go out and make protests. One person in particular, George Soros, who was a Nazi collaborator, a capo, one of the most dangerous people in the world, really an evil supervillain, is trying to stop that from happening, and so he's paying people to go out and protest and disrupt this. But I'm seeing more and more, even people on the left, saying, let's give this guy a chance. The real people who voted for Hillary Clinton, are saying, let's give this guy a chance. And that's what he deserves. If he breaks the Constitution, I would be the first to say to impeach him. But I said that, and the thing is, this time it might actually happen. There were many times that Obama went against the Constitution. He didn't get impeached because he had some protection. Trump doesn't have that, and so he has to follow the Constitution. He's not going to get away with it. And so, Hillary would have gotten away with it. Trump isn't going to get away with it. And so I think we're going to get restoration and unity that we never saw before. It's possible, but we should be cautiously optimistic, because it's just as possible that things could be just as bad as, or even worse than people imagined. And so how do we do? What do we do? Thanksgiving is the day to focus on that, to give thanks to God. And by virtue of Thanksgiving, if we start off everything we do with thanking God every day, all the time, thanking God. Start the day with thanking God that we opened our eyes. We're going to have a good life. We're going to have good things. We're going to see restoration. And hopefully we're going to see eventually, when God desires, the total restoration back to Eden, with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu b'meher b'yameinu, and the Messianic age that we're all looking forward to, when everything is really going to be restored to how it's supposed to be. And that's what the real progress that we're looking forward to, when all the world will be united and in love with God and serving God all together, all the nations. And that day the Lord shall be one and his name shall be one. Amen. God bless. And happy Thanksgiving.